A friend of mine posted a question on Facebook. This is an atheist friend of mine, and he does this from time to time. But this question was, what is something about atheists that drives you nuts? And I didn't really dive into the comments of that one. It would take too much of my day, but it got me thinking. And in some ways, this video can be seen as a response to that question. But more fundamentally, this is a way for me to kind of talk about some things that I notice atheists do that really catch Christians off guard and tend to, I don't know, worry some of us. It doesn't really bother me when this happens so much as I see other Christians not knowing how to respond to this. So if that's you, I hope you walk away from this video with an understanding that when you encounter an atheist say any of these things, you really have nothing to worry about because it really shouldn't trouble you. But it happens all the time, and that's really why it ranks on the list of things that bother me that atheists tend to do. And the first is really this idea that they bring up these objections that seem really obvious. It's the objection of, could God create a rock so heavy that he couldn't lift it? Or the objection of, well, who created God? It's the famous Dawkins question, right, from the God delusion. And I've seen people who have kind of lost their faith over these questions. I've seen atheists bring these up as sort of these knockdown objections that sort of demolish the Christian faith. And it's always quite puzzling because, okay, it seems obvious. And there's something about anything that seems obvious that we should be aware of. And that's the possibility that it actually is an obvious question. I mean, let's think about it. Who created God? What could be a more obvious question than that? And to be fair, I've answered both the question of who created God and the question of could God create a rock so heavy he couldn't lift it in previous videos. So I will link to those videos in the description, but the point is these questions seem obvious. And whenever something seems obvious, you should always wonder, has anyone thought about this before? Anyone at all? And Christianity in particular has a rich intellectual tradition, hundreds and hundreds of years of the most intelligent people on the planet spending their time thinking about God, thinking about the Christian scriptures, and quite frankly, it seems a bit ridiculous when you actually reflect on how long Christianity has been around and the intellect of the Christian founders and the sort of level of depth of their reflections. It seems pretty ridiculous to raise a question like who created God or could God create a rock so heavy he couldn't lift it and expect that to actually be a significant objection to the Christian faith. Because are you really thinking that nobody in the history of the Christian intellectual tradition has thought about that? Does that really seem like all that reasonable of an assumption? But if that's the objection that's being raised, it kind of seems like that's what they're saying, that this ridiculously obvious objection has never been thought of before in the history of Christian thought. No, that's not reasonable. So when this objection that seems to come up is really obvious, and I would even say in many cases, whenever someone would bring up something like really blatant contradictions, apparently blatant contradictions in scripture as a reason to abandon the Christian faith, my guess is some of the church fathers knew scripture far better than just about any of us alive today. And if it didn't bother them, I really don't think it should bother us. They're a lot closer to what was going on there, and it doesn't seem all that reasonable to bother me today when the people who spent their time studying that stuff, right? I have a day job. These guys, their day job was studying scripture. So if it didn't bother them, why should it bother me? That's another point to make. Sort of related to this question of these obvious objections. So it really bothers me when atheists bring up obvious objections because if it really is so obvious, someone thought of it before, hundreds of years before you did, and they probably answered it. So the fact that you think it's this earth-shattering objection speaks more to your lack of research than it does to sort of the significance of the question itself. So that's the first one. The second one is this tendency of atheists to say something to the effect of, well, I'm an atheist because I read the Bible. Okay, let's think about this. Are you really an atheist because you read the Bible? Is that the causal connection? You read the Bible, therefore you became an atheist. And the implication is sort of that reading the Bible, whatever is in the Bible, is something that logically made them become an atheist. But that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense for a lot of reasons, right? One, there are millions of Christians, billions of Christians, really, but let's just say millions of Christians who read their Bible every day, who have read their Bible multiple times through, cover to cover, and have spent a lot of time studying Scripture. They're not atheists, so what's different? What's different is something, right? If it's not the Bible, because millions of people read the Bible and remain Christian, if it's not the Bible that made them become an atheist, it's the Bible plus something. So they became atheists because they read the Bible in some sort of personal context, some sort of cultural context, historical context, whatever that context was, psychological context, that, in conjunction with reading the Bible, has a lot more to do with it than just reading the Bible alone. And you could say there are a lot of presuppositions they might have brought with them when they read the Bible. So it's not really about the reading the Bible thing. When atheists say they're an atheist because they read the Bible, that's sort of this swipe at Christians, I guess, implying that most Christians don't actually read their Bible, and that may be a fair implication. Most Christians probably don't read their Bible as much as they should. But to say that there's something about the Bible itself that led them to be an atheist is a bit of an overstatement. I mean, after all, we have thousands of people who obtain PhDs in New Testament studies, Old Testament studies, Bible in general, and they remain Christians. They enter a career field where they are studying the Bible each and every day and remain Christians. So what's different is not the Bible. Reading the Bible is not what made them an atheist. It's whatever baggage they brought with them when they read the Bible. That has a lot more to do with what made them an atheist than reading the Bible itself. So the second one is basically reading the Bible making them an atheist. No, that really drives me a little bit nuts because that's not how it works. And the third one is this, I don't know if they come outright and say it, but sometimes they do. It's this idea that, well, they were a Christian until they took their faith, critically. They started to critically examine what they believed. And it was that critical examination that led them into atheism. And that may be true for them in a sense, but it's when they take that a step further and say, if only you would apply that same level of critical thinking to your faith. That's kind of the implication if they don't say it outright, that if only us poor Christians would apply that same level of critical thinking, then we would be enlightened like they are. We would leave the Christian faith like they have. And I'm sorry, but again, that simply doesn't work. Maybe many Christians out there, maybe if you're out there, you think, maybe you've taken a lot on just sort of this blind faith. You haven't studied a ton. And if that's the case, I'd encourage you to actually take up some serious Christian study and serious critical thinking about the Christian faith, because I have full confidence that if you honestly and openly seek for truth regarding the Christian faith, you will see that the Christian faith is true. And that's not for a lack of critical examination. I mean, I have literally hundreds of books behind me that I have read for the sole purpose of critically examining my faith. And I'm not even anywhere close to where some of my friends are who have really taken some deep dives into certain specific areas of the Christian faith and have done some excellent academic research in areas regarding the Christian faith. Am I to believe that these people haven't critically examined their faith, or that I haven't critically examined my faith? And let's be honest, the evidence is against anyone who wants to say that us as Christians, us individual Christians, have not critically examined our faith. And most of the people who I know who would imply something like this, and this is just to be honest, have done nowhere near the level of research, nowhere near the level of reading, haven't listened to anywhere near as many lectures as I have regarding not just the defense of the Christian faith, but Christian doctrine, Christian theology, philosophy, and even objections regarding the Christian faith. So this seems to be a little bit disingenuous of an objection that is thrown out there. I don't know if it's a confidence booster, if it's just kind of meant to throw Christians off guard, but a lot of Christians might get caught off guard by the fact that, yeah, this atheist is accusing them of not critically examining their faith. And let's be honest, say you grew up in a youth ministry, most youth ministries don't actually teach their students how to critically examine their faith. Some do, but most don't. So it very well may be the case that many Christians out there have not critically examined their faith, but that doesn't mean that if you do critically examine your faith, you will then lose your faith. And that's sort of what these atheists are implying when they say these sorts of things, that they were a Christian until they critically examined their faith, and you should do that too, that sort of thing. Now, again, I'm saying atheists as if it's this single group of people, but atheists are not really monolithic like that. These are very specific things that some atheists say, some don't, but these are kinds of things that, if you take your faith seriously, should drive you a little bit nuts, because you know how absurd they are. Yet, oftentimes atheists bring them up as though they're really revolutionary statements. And I think that's a bit unfair. So if you run into someone who says, some of the obvious objections, something like, who created God, or could God create a rock so heavy he couldn't lift it? Or if you run into an atheist who says something to the effect of, well, they actually read their Bible and that's why they're an atheist. Or if you run into someone who says that if you critically examine your faith, you will lose your faith, that's sort of the implication they make, then I encourage you to kind of take a step back and realize that in none of these cases are they really making all that strong of a statement, or all that strong of a case. They're not really saying anything that should sway you one way or another. If any of those things were true, we wouldn't have such an rich intellectual tradition of the Christian faith. We wouldn't have academic philosophers in the university today. And there are several really good academic philosophers at even secular universities who are writing defenses of the Christian faith. So if any of these things were true, this would not be the case. We would not have people who would write dissertations regarding the Bible, regarding Christian philosophy, theistic arguments. Now I'm kind of just rambling a little bit, but the point is, yeah, there are some things that drive me nuts that some atheists say, but it's not really just because they're saying it. It's because if you are not well trained in your faith, you might think that they're actually making a good point when the reality is they're not. So that's kind of what I want to leave you with. Whenever you run into an atheist who's saying something and you feel like they're making a good point, I encourage you to pause, take a step back, and reflect on the intellectual richness of the Christian tradition. Historically and really currently, those Christian academics who are in universities writing and researching today, reflect on that fact alone and think, maybe this person's missing something when they raise this objection. Maybe they're missing something. So with that, I'm just going to leave it here. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you found this to be beneficial, enlightening, insightful, whatever you want to call it. Yeah. If you enjoyed it, give us a like, write us a note in the comments, and subscribe. And don't forget to share this with any friends that you think might be able to benefit from this.